Welcome, everyone, to episode 7 of the MBE Enterprise Podcast, where we talk about money, business, and entrepreneurship with some of the brightest business minds I know. Today, I am joined by entrepreneur Mark Wilhelm. Mark, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing awesome, man. Thank you. Super excited for this episode. And Mark, I really just want to start this one off by let's catch up a little bit since the business competition we were both at, national business competition, I might add. I know you recently graduated. Take me through a little bit kind of what's going on in your life right now and kind of just what you're thinking on that and what you're up to.
Yeah. So currently I'm working for a Philly-based company called Wodify. So it's a app develop company that provides a business management software for gyms. So they started by targeting CrossFit industry, got very popular, very successful within that section of the wellness industry. And now they have pivoted more towards being a customer acquisition and retention platform for gyms and have began to expand beyond just CrossFit to entering martial arts, MMA, and primarily jiu-jitsu.
Awesome. Mark, what did you say the name of that company was again?
Wodify. So that's WODFIFY. That's what it is. I always mix it up.
Got you. So a little more specifically, I know you mentioned client acquisition, retention. What are some of the more specific roles, like day to day, that you're kind of doing with Wodify right now?
Yeah. So I got this job through a program called VFA, which is Venture for America. So it's a fellowship program that takes recent college grads and basically just puts them in a community and environment that promotes getting into startup businesses. So I found out about Wodify through their Connect platform, which is essentially just a job search with all over the nation, companies in 13 major cities. And the position that I got with Wodify is called their Associate Rotational Program. So it's a rotation of 6 months for 2 years. So I'm starting out in their CS, which is customer success, essentially working with customer. And I've just been, really boots on the ground, just getting to hear all the complaints and, the good things as well from all of our clients and our clients' clients as well.
So I would say that client acquisition, retention, and then also the actual customer relationships are pretty tied together. When you say that you're working with clients, customers, would you say that you're more on that like customer relationship end, or are you maybe more on the front lines of like actually acquiring them, building them, and then retaining them through like, when I ask about retention, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. There's like analyzing the data of it and figuring kind of like what the company needs to do better in order to retain them from the analytics side of things. And then there's also the customer relationships like itself, I feel like, side of things, where like actually interacting with them on a day-to-day basis. Would you say that's stuff that you do? You do both of those, or you primarily do one or the other? That's my question for you.
Yeah. So the customer acquisition and retention aspect of our platform is primarily it's shown through the services we provide through our software. So we just make it a lot, it's like 10, 100 times easier for these gyms to, send out communications to their clients because I think it's about 80% is the statistic of new members to a gym or martial arts or whatever are going to leave within the first 90 days. So we really drop that number quite significantly just with our app that we have that really just ties the client to their gym admins so that they know what they're doing. They have a really detailed report of all the workouts, all the plans, everything that they need with that. So that's one of the major aspects of our company that is retaining customers for the gym. On my side, I'm kind of what I'm doing is helping retain the customers for us. So I'm, one of the faces that these people are going to see when they have a problem. So how I answer that problem is going to, that could be a make it or break it for somebody if they're going to want to stay. Because if you don't have good customer service, then why am I going to stay with you if you're not going to help me, at least work through my problems, work through to find a solution. So I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but
No, that totally does. And I think that kind of, for anyone listening to, that kind of clears up just a little more exactly, gets a better understanding. You guys are working with the gyms, like in the way the gyms are your clients, right? They're the ones kind of using the app from you, but the people
yeah,
you're actually serving are the customers and keeping them connected with the gym. So it's kind of an interesting business model in that way. I think it's becoming
definitely.
a little more popular of one, but yeah, definitely a little bit unique in that sense. One of the things you mentioned there, Mark, was you are the one actually talking with that customer, right? Having that relationship a lot of times when things go wrong. Now with that, you've been, you've been thrown into the fire, tossed into the flames. You got to figure things out. Are there some lessons that you've learned that you could maybe tell the listeners a little bit about just how you deal with those issues in the most effective manner possible?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the biggest things for me is just having a learning attitude. So I have to be willing to ask questions. So if I can't figure something out, I'm going to go to somebody who knows more than me. That's not to try and use somebody as a crutch for my own you know capabilities or something, but it's more of a how can I learn how to respond in the best way so that in the future, when I get the same question or a different question, I can tie what I know back into that so that I can create the best response, the most apathetic, understanding, um, you know, response to the people that are going to be having these problems. Because if you aren't willing to listen to somebody, if you aren't apathetic towards what their real problems are, because in a situation of gym owners, like that's their lifeblood in a lot of ways, and they don't want to be thinking about how can I run this business. They just want to be thinking about how can I provide this service for my clients. So if we can take some of that burden off of them and make them understand that they are being heard and they are being listened to and we are respecting them, then that's the best job that I can do.
Certainly, certainly. You bring up that point of you were talking with them, and if there's something that you don't necessarily know how to answer or how to solve right away, you'll just jump in, find someone who does, like you said, not as just a crutch to solve it, but as helping yourself learn then for the future if that situation arises again. Something my head goes to there when you bring this up is the idea of just jumping in and talking to the person that needs to be talked to learn what you can learn from them. And what that brings up to me is a popular business term, networking. um, when you're networking, because I'm sure as any business or entrepreneurship major especially has done, um, how are those skills things that you use in that regard as well when networking, just kind of jumping in, getting to know people? Are there different strategies you'll use for, I don't want to make it sound like a used car salesman type of vibe, right? But like, are there
Yeah,
strategies you'll take for how to better network with certain individuals or not?
for sure. Yeah. Networking for me is it's a love hate relationship, I'll say, because I'm somebody I hate like I love the hustle culture, everything about entrepreneurship in that regards, but like just the putting the just smacking the label of like hustler or like networking, so many things like that just can come off as disingenuous, which is something like I don't want to emulate with how I interact with people. So I take networking very seriously, but I'm not there just to boost my ego, boost my numbers, anything like that. I want to know who this person is, how I can have an impact on them, and how they can have an impact on me. It's not me trying to, how can they help me achieve my goals? It's, how can we both win at things? How can we both move forward, get the best results that we can? And basically, just at the end of the day, how can we get results?
For sure. I was listening actually to a podcast recently. I believe it was Lex Friedman and Andrew Huberman, for any of people that are
Good stuff.
familiar with them. So they had an episode recently, and they were actually talking about that exact thing you just mentioned, relationships wise, which is overt versus covert relationships. And I found this to be super interesting in that essentially, the optimal, it sounds obvious, right? But like the optimal form of a relationship is an overt relationship. And that essentially means that both parties are looking to benefit while also benefiting the other party. Like it seems super basic, but you get into a lot of negative things that arise in whether it's like romantic relationships, business relationships, any of the above when you start getting into covert relationships. And
Yeah,
covert relationships are more so, I obviously want something from you. I am like, okay, you're probably going to get something from me also, but then because of that, I like want to get more out of you because I want to
yeah,
win instead of just a mutual gain. So I like that you brought that up of just the kind of the mutual gain. Like, how can I also benefit them if they're benefiting me, and not just being like I brought up that almost used car salesman vibe of like, okay, I'm just
yeah,
trying to do this. I'm trying to network here. I just want to get the information from you guys. I don't really care if you know, have any benefit in the deal. So I like that. It made me think of that the other day too. I feel like I always connect just almost random things in a way, but from podcasts I listen to because they're just
for
fresh in
sure.
your head. It's crazy how that works.
Yeah,
Stepping back a little bit to Wodify, kind of where we were, one of the things that I would imagine an app like that has to keep up with are market trends, adapting to those trends, staying ahead of the competition. Can you speak to that a little bit, whether it's within the app itself, the business that you're working with currently, or
yeah,
just general things in the past that you have learned on those topics?
yeah, definitely. Um, I can speak a little bit towards where I'm working currently. So Wodify, it started back in, I believe it would have been 2013, and they were essentially the first to do anything like this, especially for CrossFit, which was their target market. And they just broke onto the scene, were majorly successful, and then what happens is people will copy that or make their own adjustments, and then there's competition. So that's been what Wodify has been facing, and that's why they've made the pivot towards, instead of being just a business, a software that provides a service as a business for these gyms, they're pivoting to be a customer acquisition and retention. And that's their main focus right now because nobody else is doing that within our field. So it's really just changing, making that slight pivot so that what's going to be our differentiating factor. Because if you're, I don't want to say if you're not first, then you're last, but in a lot of ways, if you're first, you're more than likely going to have 50% of whatever market share you're jumping into, and that can go for so many things in life beyond just business.
For sure. Yeah. I have to ask you, Mark, because you mentioned the gym space. Have you ever, and I bring this up every episode, have you ever heard of Alex Hormozy?
It sounds familiar, but it's
Okay. So
escaping me right now.
he's super popular. I feel like he's gained a ton of popularity in like the last 8 months or so. I guess I found him on YouTube. He has a podcast on Spotify. I'm sure other platforms as well. I think it's called The Game. And
Yep, yep,
yeah, he talks business, and I love a lot of his principles. I always bring him up on the podcast, stuff he's said that's
yeah.
influenced me. If I could get him on the podcast one day, that'd be absolutely pristine. That's probably end game goal right there. But
There we go.
yeah, just bringing up the whole concept with gyms made me think of that, the business personality, and I just had to ask you if you were aware of him or not, or knew of any of his stuff. But aside from that, here, one of the things you talked about earlier is just the idea of just jumping into things, whether it's starting something new in any category of life, or jumping in and meeting a new person, or jumping in to learn something from someone that you need to figure out. The concept of jumping in and just doing things, just taking the first step, is an extremely important one in terms of
Yeah,
entrepreneurship, but also just life as a whole, really kind of living on the edge of your comfort zone, learning new things, not being afraid to learn new things. And what this takes me back to actually is how we originally met, which was at this national business competition, entrepreneurship, I guess, startup business competition. You were pitching a company with my previous guest, I believe, Luke, called Just Pause at the time. And Luke talked a little bit
Yep.
about it, but not a ton. If you could kind of just speak a little bit about maybe what that experience was like as a whole, how you guys kind of started your journey with Just Pause, and then kind of the business competition experience as well.
Yeah, for sure. So Luke and I, we've been friends since freshman year of college, and where Just Pause came from was it came from a business class. So it was kind of one of our capstone classes for entrepreneurship major, and our goal, the original goal was just to get into the business competition at our school, but uh, as time progressed, we figured, why don't we do something more with this, and why don't we like shoot for something higher? And just that alone was a little nerve wracking in a lot of ways for me because I don't want to fail. I don't want to uh, be embarrassed. I don't want to make a mistake. But you have to be willing to make mistakes in order to learn. That's why I'm on a podcast for the first time in my life. So I'm doing these things that I'm not used to. I'm out of my comfort zone, and I think for myself personally, when I'm at my best, it's when I am willing and ready to take calculated risks and to make a decision that there's potential for failure, but I know my capabilities and I know it's going to stretch them, but I know no matter what, I'm going to be better off on the other side. And on the flip side, when I'm at my worst is when I am self doubting, when I am telling myself, you just can't do that. And then I ask myself, what's the reason? And it's just, you can't. And that's it's an extremely toxic and imprisoning mindset to be in because there's no way that you're going to get out of that unless you tell yourself, or you don't even tell yourself, you just do something. You have to do something. You have to take a risk, take a chance with whatever it is. And Just Pause was great because that was one of the moments where it was incredibly validating because this was a project that Luke and I worked on for maybe a month and a half, 2 months, and we got accepted to go to eFest. And by that point, we were maybe like a quarter of the way done with the work that we had by the time we got to eFest. But just knowing that off of that little bit of information, we were able to, make it all the way to a national business competition it was great because it gave me some confidence. It gave me, it made me realize that, when I was questioning myself a lot during that time of, am I supposed to be an entrepreneur? Am I supposed to be doing this stuff? It was confirming that, no, this is where I should be. This is what I should do. Like, I like the risk. I like to do things that there is a chance for failure, but, you're going to learn a lot along the way.
Certainly, yeah. Well, first of all, I'm glad you decided to start saying yes to more things and be on this podcast because, like you mentioned, we wouldn't be here right now if that weren't the case. You brought up a lot of things I want to talk about there. One of them being calculated risks. And we've talked about this. I've talked about this with a couple of different people on this podcast. But coming to the realization, for you, of just how important those are, especially with entrepreneurship, but just life in general, I think is so important because I brought up something the other day, which was the concept I found out of a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And the concept of this that I've talked about before is, say you're flipping a coin. Someone offers you a deal. If it lands on heads, you'll lose, let's say tails. If it lands on tails, you'll lose $1,000, right? One flip. What number would it have to be? What dollar amount would it have to be on heads for you to say yes, if that's what you were winning? And what he found in his research was the average response on that was around $2,000, which sounds super irrational to a numbers person like me, because just straight up, if you're thinking about expected gain versus loss, right? Anytime the gain is higher, so $1,001, let's say, with the loss being 1,000, well, you have a positive expected return there. So then in theory, you should take that deal, right? But what it comes down to is humans' natural risk aversion is actually what the study was showing, of how people essentially, the happiness or the joy that they feel from winning that $1,000, it's not equal to the dismay they feel when losing $1,000. It's actually exaggerated. They care more about the loss because they'd have to win 2,000 to equal a loss of 1,000. Right? So humans are, and that's kind of built into our DNA. We're always looking for what's the issue, what's the problem, survival mindset, like how do I survive this, right? So it kind of gets into the idea that, well, not being satisfied, because every time we think that we're going to be satisfied at a new baseline, we'll find things to complain about. It'll just be, people talk about like a first world or versus like a third world problem or something like that, right? Depending on your level of comfort at the time, say that the small things that we'll complain about might be absolute luxuries for someone in a different situation. So I think it speaks to that. And then another thing that it speaks to is kind of being your biggest critic. And you mentioned this earlier about being your biggest critic and how that has kind of affected your life. Could you speak on that a little more? Maybe how you've learned to use that as a benefit, or how that's been an issue for you?
Yeah. So I've always been my biggest critic in just every area of life. And it's driven me to some of my lowest points, but it's also driven me to just never accept and never settle for where I'm currently at. Like I can't be doing the same thing or doing nothing for, longer than a couple days without like feeling restless. Like I could be doing the same thing, but if I feel like I am better for it and I'm learning and I'm growing as a person and I'm growing, in my capabilities, then it's worth it to me. So I would say for me, being my biggest critic has definitely had its constant, continual downsides. But it's also great because, anybody can say anything to me. And yeah, it might hurt a little bit, but it's honestly like nothing compared to like how I will feel about myself in like so many instances. And that can be a pretty toxic mindset to have if you aren't willing to do something about it and to actually take the steps towards making a change.
I think what you said there is very accurate. Yeah, it can be extremely difficult, but if you use it, and maybe how you've been learning to use it as like a motivator, as a drive to do something, because I think going back to that idea of humans never wanting to settle, right? I think something a lot of people think about is the idea of like retirement. And I promise this will make sense. Retirement, like I want to retire and just live on a beach somewhere, right? My dream retirement, essentially a vacation all the time. And I believe it was Jordan Peterson who talked about this when I first heard it. And it was the idea of, what are you going to do in that retirement, right? You're going to sit on the beach, drink margaritas, like what, endless margaritas or something, and just lay on the beach. He's like, okay, you're going to do that for a week. And then you're going to start to get ill, or after a month, you'll be like borderline dead. 3 months, you're not going to be able to sustain that. So he's like, that's not really a plan. That's not really a goal that people think it is, but it's really not, because that'll become your new baseline. And then you all of a sudden won't be satisfied when you only have 9 margaritas instead of 10. Like you will find something to complain about. So the idea of being your self-critic can be like negative if you don't act on it ever. But if you do just start acting on it, and then like you said, it kind of helps you in the fact that no one can say anything that will really bother you more than if you know in your heart that what you're doing is right and that's what you want to do, and then what other people say can't really bother you as much if you are your own critic.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like there's levels to it. If you're your own critic to the point where, you're constantly depressed, like that's an
Mm-hmm.
issue, right? But if you're just your own critic in the sense that what other people say won't bother you, if you're your own biggest critic, I should say, then I think it's definitely a benefit. And you can
Yeah.
use it to never be satisfied and stay driven and stay just improving in whatever realm it is
For
you're
sure.
working in. And also tying back into that, what I was talking about earlier with the heads, winning 2,000, tails losing 1,000. Another thing that that really gets into is in one flip, it's a win or a loss, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's where it gets hard for humans to discern, right? Like some people, I actually did a test on like 50 people, and I asked what numbers they, and some people are like 10,000, 15,000,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's a win or a loss.
Yeah.
But if you scale that out to say 50 flips, well, then I
Mm-hmm.
think almost everyone would say a lower number than they would originally say, right? Because
Yeah.
law of large numbers, it'll the output should regress back towards the mean, the average,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're going to get a high, expected return.
Yeah.
And looking at life that way, which is why I think it's extremely important you've started saying yes to things. And I want to speak to this. Looking at life through that lens, Kahneman talks about of taking calculated risks repeatedly, not once again calculated risks,
Mm-hmm.
so that none of them will completely end you, right?
Yeah.
But calculated risks to the point where you're constantly giving yourself that upside potential in a way, and
Yeah.
knowing that over the long run, you only need one, really, depending on the scale of it, to pay off, right? Or you only need a
Yeah.
couple to work. So if you're
Yeah.
not putting yourself under by failing, taking calculated risks like that is extremely beneficial. And he cites in the study
Definitely.
how they measure people's financial monetary success, and the people who are generally, obviously there's outliers, but generally more successful are the people who are less risk averse. So they're more willing to take risks. There's a positive correlation with that. And I think that kind of tells you all you need to know about the benefits to it. But the one thing is you can't take as big a risks if you don't have that baseline level to fall back on, right? Because
Yeah.
you can't just take a risk that's going to, like I said, put you under,
Yep.
So you can only take the more money, the more equity, the more capital you have, or just the better fallback options you have
Mm-hmm.
allows you to then take greater risks. And I think that's why you always see like cream constantly rising to the top in terms of
Yeah.
business, or like businesses in general. Those large corporations they're going to keep growing exponentially because other companies just can't compete. And on a personal
Yeah.
level, you can kind of get yourself in that positive upward spiral once you
Mm-hmm.
start doing well, or you can get in a negative spiral and
Yeah.
it goes the opposite way. And I think that holds true. There's so many parallels between business and just life in general, which is one of the reasons I really love it. But you mentioned your college journey and saying
Mm-hmm.
yes, and how a lot of things changed kind of then. Take me back
Mm-hmm.
to your college journey as a whole, and then tying into the moment that you really knew that entrepreneurship was what was for you.
Yeah. Yep. Um, my college life and career as a whole was ups and downs constantly. There were times where I felt like I was thriving and I was doing super well, and then there were, the next month I'd feel like I'd never been as low, and it would be a lot of, questioning, what am I doing? It was a lot of a lack of purpose, like a feeling of am what I'm doing, is it worth it? And or is it just like something I should be pursuing, period? And the point at which I first discovered that, this is something that I want to do and I think is right for me, was it came from a point of validation. My freshman year, first semester, we had a elevator pitch competition, and you had to come up with these, 2 minute or minute and a half long pitches for these theoretical businesses. And I was required by two separate classes to submit a pitch into both categories. So there was a commercial and a social. So the commercial was a commercial business, and then the social was a business focused on social impact. So I came up with two ideas. The social was, I can't remember the exact name. I think it was like Journey Art or something. But essentially, it was like a mobile art station. So it was taking art to underprivileged communities. And because I'd known in my life how much like art has served me and how much of an outlet it was and how beneficial it was just to grow your mind, your understanding, and in that way grow so many other areas of your life. So that was my first the social business, and then the commercial business was it was called like News Site, and it was essentially a motion sensing glasses for people who were visually impaired. So essentially, they could put them on, and it would alert them via vibrations if there was like an object approaching them, or they were approaching an object. So it's all very theoretical. Don't know if it would have worked, but I made it to the finals, and I was like, oh wow, this is interesting. And then I got pretty nervous, and I got it like, am I doing this right? What am I doing? Like, there's a fear of failure, and I was like, there's no way I'm going to make it towards like the top. And this was like during the height of COVID, so everybody was in their dorm rooms, and we had to like do a recording of our pitches. So I did my recordings, sent them in, and like I didn't even watch when they announced like who was winning, and I ended up winning first in commercial and then second in social, and I was like, oh shoot, yeah, maybe I'm onto something, and that was incredible for me because at that point I had people like come up to me and they were saying like, yo, great job, that was awesome. And it wasn't a vanity thing. It wasn't an ego boost. I mean, it was an ego boost, but that wasn't where I felt like a rush or a thrill from. It was the fact that I made something, I thought of something, and people liked it, and it found some success. And that was just really impactful for me because, like I said, it gave me some validation. It made it concrete that, I can do this.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's your thoughts on public speaking as a whole? Is that something
Mm.
that you've ever struggled with? I mean, I don't know if anyone like really, really loves it. I'm sure some people
Yeah.
do, but is that something that's never really been an issue for you, or something that you've had to work hard on to get better at? Because you mentioned these were recorded, but when you talked about elevator pitches, it kind of made me think of the public speaking aspect as well.
Yep. Yeah. So I love people, but I never thought I would be any good at public speaking. And it's something that's just taken a lot of work. I'm by no means, I would say, a gifted public speaker, but I can talk in front of people. So if you told me to, get up in front of a crowd of, 200 people, 500 people, and just say something, or just better yet, to just talk, I could probably do it, but I couldn't think about it. I would have to just do it. Because when I start to think about it, that's when you get nervous. That's when you like worry about, oh, what are these people going to think of me? When in reality, like most of those people out there, like they would never get out in front of those people. Like you just doing that shows a lot about what kind of person you are, what kind of character you have, and learn from what you've done, like how you present yourself, who you are, how you speak, what tone of voice are you using, trying to keep it like a conversation. For me, that's where I've had the most success, is treating the audience like I'm talking to each individual person, where I am trying to, because I can hold a conversation with most people, no problem. But when you're in front of all those faces looking at you, you're like, okay, well, who do I focus on? Well, you focus on this person, then you focus on that person, and that shows engagement. And when you do that, that's where you can, get into a free flow. You can start really talking. You can articulate your points in a much more organic fashion. Whereas if you're just reading off of cards, it comes off sometimes it's disingenuous.
Definitely. I think you gave some good public speaking tips to people just there too. And one thing you brought up is the idea of overthinking it. Right, you start thinking too much about it, and then you start screwing up. And I find it interesting that you guys had to, well, not interesting, but that you had to record those elevator pitches. Because for me, whenever I have to record things like that, which is ironic since I'm doing this podcast and it's recorded, but whenever I have to record things like that, and you're allowed to do, say, like multiple takes, it drives me insane because
Yeah.
I'll do the first one and it'll be like probably pretty good because
Mm-hmm.
there's a different level to it, right? When you're
Yeah.
recording something and people know it's a recording, they'll hear it and be like, they'll notice, I feel like, little things, like little
Yeah.
mishaps, little stutters. But if you're talking just in person, just like literally public speaking, you could say ums and ahs all the time, and not all the time, but like you could say some and people won't even notice them because it's just so common in speech. So that's something for me that, like, if I was recording an elevator pitch like that, I feel like it would literally take me 30 hours because my first one would be probably fine. And
Yeah.
then I would try and do it and I'd start thinking about it. And then it would just continually screw me up. And I'd be like, oh, I'm so close to the end. I haven't messed up yet. And then I mess up. And I'd be
Yeah.
like, where if it was just in person? So it's funny because a lot of people talk about how they'd rather do a recording, say, than a live, speech in front of people. And for me, I feel like I've always been the opposite. I'm like, if I do a recording, I'll do it 700 times trying to get it absolutely perfect. Whereas
Yeah.
if it's a public speaking thing, that's never been a huge issue for me. I still get nervous at times, but kind of like you, right? Like you could do it if you needed to, and it's not 40 million people, but I think that's something that's interesting. Just kind of the different perspectives around public speaking, I guess, as a whole. And another thing you brought up there was art. And I think this was interesting because we didn't talk about this before we started the episode at all, but delve a little deeper into what art means to you. I've personally been someone who, I have one friend that I used to do a podcast with, and we would talk about some like deep. I know we were going to mention Meditations by Marcus Aurelius in a little bit as well. We talk about some deep philosophical concepts, and just art is one of them. I feel like that always comes up, right? Whether art drives innovation in the future, or whether innovation in the future drives art. So just speak a little, I guess, on honestly just art as a whole and how that's played a role in your life.
Yeah, definitely. I've been, art has been a thing for me since, I was old enough to basically hold a crayon. Like I remember quite vividly like using like a colored pencil or a crayon or something to like draw when I was like 5 years old, like something that I thought looked pretty cool, but it was literally just like scribbles. And that was it. It was something that I did all, when I was a kid, and then a lot during high school, and then kind of dropped off in college, and then started picking it back up. But that was probably one of the first things where I had to really work at. Like I don't think I'm like a naturally like gifted artist. I just can understand how things like the way things like look. Like if something looks good, like you just know. Like even if somebody says like they can't do art, like you're gonna know what looks good. Like there are things that look cool for sure, but there's a lot of art. I personally feel like there's a lot of art out there that just doesn't really achieve much of anything. It might be, there's shock value to it, or there's some sort of aspect in that capacity. But in a lot of ways, I think what art is, it's a reflection of beauty and just what works in a lot of ways. It's a very difficult concept, I would say, but there's certain, even going to like modern art, certain modern art is it's different. There's certain ones where it's just like cubes and shapes, whatever it might be, and it's just there. But then there's other ones that could be very similar, but there's just something about it that is different and it's intangible. And for me, like art has been that. It's been something, it's trying to create something tangible to capture something that's intangible. And I try to bring that as much as I can to almost every aspect of my life. Like I I try to live a certain way, not because of, the tangible results necessarily, but because of what those tangible results reflect, because of what they mean, and how that, uh, for, the choices I make in my life, uh, they might have tangible results, but the intangible aspect is like, is that reflecting my character? Is that reflecting who I am? Because going even to networking, like when you talk to somebody, those intangible things are going to jump out. I don't think I would be in the situation I'm in life if I was pretending to be someone else. I was given many opportunities to do that, and even told to do that when I was applying for my fellowship, when I was, applying for this job. But I said no. If they like me for who I am, then that's great because that means I think I'm going in the right direction. But if they don't like me for who I am, well, then I wouldn't have been a good fit anyway.
I think it's extremely interesting what you brought up there and how you tied together art and life. I'd never thought of this before, but you brought up art as trying to build or paint a tangible representation of something that is intangible. And then how I tied that to life, I guess, when you brought it up was your actions and your being as a whole is kind of trying to build or paint a tangible picture.
Yep.
How you're acting for a greater, or however you want to view it, intangible kind of meaning or purpose. And I think that's something that really is, that's interesting. I'm going to have to send that to that buddy of mine because that's really cool. I've never thought about it like that. When you're talking art, I'm assuming a lot of people reference it as just, imagery. What's your thoughts on music as an art as well?
Oh yeah, I'm not somebody gifted in music, but I love it. And I love the emotions it will elicit for me. Like I'll say like my favorite type of music to listen to is typically like soundtracks from movies. It could be video games, it could be whatever. And it's not necessarily, sometimes I will like, I'll remember what's happening in the movie when this is happening, but it's more of, what is this making me think of? What is this? What's the emotions that are coming from it? It's not just like dead white noise. It's not just a distraction. Sometimes music can be just a distraction, and sometimes that can be beneficial. But there is just with painting or drawing or creating art in that medium, music as well can be a reflection of what is beautiful, what is good, what is pointing towards, I don't want to say necessarily being better, but if you hear good music, you'll know that, it's good. It's the same thing as like looking at art. Like you can hear certain music and it might be catchy, but there's no, I don't want to say no redeeming qualities because I think you can find redeeming qualities no matter how slight in pretty much anything.
I do think what you're saying makes sense there. And I actually, once again, going back to a podcast that I recently listened to was with Zach Bryan on the Joe Rogan Experience. And this is something I think ties in well to that, whether you're a country music fan or not, I guess. Zach Bryan, he has a very distinct sound, not so much sound, but a very distinct style in the way he writes too. And I think they bring this up, they touch on this, how, like you said, some music, it's just, you can tell it's catchy. It's going to get listens. It's probably going to be at the top of the charts, depending on who's saying it. But there's just not really that underlying meaning. And I think that's something that the one point where I disagree with you is the fact that everyone can kind of see it. Because I don't necessarily think that everyone can always see it, right? I think there's people that are fans of Zach Bryan, for example, who he doesn't have the best voice, just like from a musical perspective, but it's his songwriting that I think really grips people. And as someone who, I feel like I'm basic kind of when it comes to music, like I like the catchy stuff. Um, I hadn't really ever given his stuff a ton of chances because I heard a couple and I was like, they're all right, but it's not
Yeah.
that great. Whereas I really started listening to a couple of his albums more, and I wouldn't say he's my favorite artist or anything right now, right away, but it definitely grew on me, and I started to really understand what that kind of next level meaning really actually was,
Yeah.
and why people are just why he's exploded so much and why they're such big fans of him. And I think that is something that, once again, it's intangible. You're trying to put a tangible kind of definition or meaning on something that just isn't tangible. And going back to even art as a whole, it's just so interesting. And you talk about the pictures, right? Visual art. That's another area where, like, someone like me, I think you can ask anyone who knows me and they'll be like, Matt could not design anything like aesthetically. It would look horrible. Right. So I don't think that necessarily everyone has it in that way. Like, if
Yeah.
given two options, I think I might be able to discern which one looks good and which one doesn't. But as far as actually creating it from within, I think it's interesting because that's definitely something that I don't think I am as good at it. I mean, it doesn't really bother me. Like, it's not,
Yeah.
I think if I practiced it, I'd get better. Right. But it's
Yeah.
just something that I don't think
Definitely.
everyone naturally has. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. Would you consider podcasts as a form of art?
I would, because I believe anybody who's gifted with uh, speaking, with being able to convey a message or a thought orally, is partaken in a form of art. And to touch back on the point that you disagreed with me, I think I should have put a caveat with that, where I think people can and do know what's good if they're willing to learn and take a step back, take time to like listen and actually question. Because if you're not questioning things, you're just going to follow the herd. You're going to follow what's popular. Like you're just going to listen to what's on the chart, and you're going to enjoy it, and that's fine. But if you are if you try to question things, if you try to dive deeper, dissect that thing, then that's when you may not know exactly why. And it takes time, it takes, effort. And that's the thing. It's hard. It's hard to know what's good, what, I don't want to say what has value, but what might have more value than another thing when it comes to art or creation. And I think a lot of people just don't want to put in the effort, or quite honestly don't have the time to put in the effort. So I can't knock anybody for not, appreciating art. I won't pretend to be somebody where, I believe that if you like modern art, then you're a garbage person. I don't believe that at all. Like I'm somebody who used to be extremely, I used to not like modern art. I used to not like, different forms of expression if it didn't conform with how I express myself, especially within art. And what it took was for me to take a step back and to, look at myself, look at like why do I feel that way? Why do I think that way? Why do I hold this with more value than like why do I hold X with more value than Y? And sometimes it might just come out to, X has more utility, or maybe it more readily conveys genuine emotion than Y, whatever it might be, whatever you are using as a measuring stick. Uh, but then sometimes you'll find that, oh, Y actually does have traces or extreme amounts. You just have to look for it.
Yeah, a lot of things there. First of all, I would agree with you. I think podcasting has become an art form in a way. And
Mm-hmm.
not just because I've made one now that's not very popular, but just the ability, like you said, to convey your thoughts orally, speak them, really just speak what you think, I think is something that is extremely hard to like really do.
Yeah.
Like, you think it's easy to just talk and have conversations with people, like deep conversations with, like, something that's interesting, I think, is the Joe Rogan Experience, right? It's the biggest podcast on the planet. Why? Well, for one, he's been doing it for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
For two, he was already a fairly popular figure going into it, so he could have some good guests on, you know. But I think what really separates it is his ability to have good conversations. Like,
Yeah,
him being a comedian and being able to read a room, right, as far as jokes, but then
definitely.
also just read the person and in the interaction as it's going,
Mm-hmm.
I think he might be the best in the world at it. You know, like,
Yeah.
I think that's why his podcast, because he has everyone on now, tons
Yeah.
of different people, and the conversations they have are always just. I mean, sometimes he'll have people on that it's just kind of a more of a dumb conversation, but then he'll have people on that you would expect it to be not the most deep conversation, and they'll get into topics that you just never would have guessed and that they'll
Yeah.
never talk about outside of that episode. And I think that really is an art form in that way, and just being able to ask questions too.
Mm-hmm.
People don't understand how hard that is, like really asking good questions. And maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just not that good at it, you know, I don't know, but that's something I notice when having people on a podcast, especially when it's like live like this. It's not live, but recorded, and you can't just screw up constantly, you
Mm-hmm.
know. It really is something that's a skill that's developed, and part of the reason I wanted to do it was to further develop the skill of just like
Definitely.
speaking and conversing, getting better at listening, asking better questions to really better understand things, as opposed to just like nodding your head saying okay, maybe asking a question. I think that's just something that it starts when we're young. Like, people are worried about asking questions. They don't want to appear as though they're wrong or don't understand things. Or then, you know, a teacher say, it's not like it's the teacher's fault, but like a teacher might be like, oh, everyone has to ask a question. And people will just think of like, how many times have you been in class? And they'll say, you know, are there any questions? No one will raise their hand. Is that because they are scared to ask it? Possibly. But I think it also comes down to like, you'll have a couple people ask questions right away in a situation like that. And I feel like everyone else in the class will be like, oh, that's what I was going to ask, you know, like, oh, that was what
Yeah.
I was going to like. There's like these certain like superficial kind of like just basic questions that get asked
Definitely. Yeah.
that are just categories of like, you're just throwing that one out there because it's such a
Mm-hmm.
classic question in a way.
Yeah.
But really being able to listen, like dig deep and really ask those good questions is part of the reason that I wanted to do this. And I think that is definitely a skill, and just conversation is a skill as a whole. Another thing that you brought up earlier, I wanted to agree with you on. I love listening to soundtracks too. Like, there's a time and a place for them where I like them versus when I don't.
Yeah.
But that is something that I do also really enjoy. Maybe not the whole soundtrack, but if it's a particularly gripping scene that I enjoyed, then I'll certainly have some soundtracks on my Apple Music playlist.
For sure.
And lastly, to not talk about art for 3 hours, how do you think art relates to business? Are there specific things within any category of what we talked about that you think relate well to business? Is business an art form? You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
Touch on that a little.
Yeah. Um, I think with so many things, it's no cut and dry answer. So, do I think business is an art form? I think it can. Do I think certain uh, businesses are a form of art? For sure. Um, but how art relates to business, I think it relates to it very, I think it's very covert in a lot of ways, bringing the covert over it. Um, and that can either be in what's the design, what's the aesthetics of this business, of especially with like apps, things like that. Like, yes, there's UI. So like how easy is it for the user to use this? So like
UI
the
being
what's
user interface.
yes, sorry. So how easy is it for the user to be using the app? And then there's UX, which is the experience. So it's like how does the result in an experience for the user? So is it easy to use? Great, but does it look terrible? Does it look like it was made in like 2002 or whatever, like in the mid 90s? You're probably not going to have, if it's between that or a slightly less effective app, but it looks like it was made this year. People might be using that app that is less effective because they know, and this goes into more of what I was saying of people knowing more intrinsically of you're going to know when an app works because it's easy for you. It cuts down on time. It makes it less time you have to think about, less clicks, whatever. But then there's the value of, is it good to look at? Is it something that you are not going to be like a good app? I think either you are like, every time you open it, you're like, this looks great, but that gets old. I think one of the best things is you don't even think about it. It's just so easy to use. It's just so natural because the UX and the UI tie in so similarly that it just creates a great experience for you, and it just makes your life easier, better, whatever you want. And then moving outside of just app development, I think art is still definitely an aspect within other companies. But definitely, I think design, products, all of that are heavily tied.
You talk about the app creation and the idea of the user interface versus the user experience. I think that also ties in well to just business as a whole, right? You have the user interface, kind of what you're seeing right away, how you're getting connected with it. And that's marketing, right? Advertising, like how you're bringing the customer in, their first impressions. And then the experience is more of the product side, right? Of the
Mm-hmm.
actual, the thing they're using, how are they liking it, or the service, either way. And I have to bring up now this podcast I was just listening to today. As you can tell, I listen to a fair amount, usually just while I'm eating in between work. And it was Hormozy talking about the idea of how important marketing and advertising is. And what he was talking about he just brought up an interesting little thought experiment. And it was, say you're selling hot dogs and your job is to sell the most amount of hot dogs within a 1 hour period, right?
Yeah.
If you could pick like one thing to control about the hot dogs, the people buying them, what would that one thing kind of be that you could control, the most important thing? And everyone immediately goes to, well, I want the best hot dogs. I want to be selling the best hot dogs, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, why would you want that when you could say, I want everyone to be hungry?
Mm.
Or not in a hungry like a
Yeah.
dystopian like bad sense, but I just want everyone to be hungry so I can sell them. Or I want my location to be right outside the stadium when everyone's leaving, or
Yeah.
coming in. And the idea of that, your product, you can make it amazing,
Yeah.
but the dance between the product and the marketing advertising side is so
Yeah.
important, because you won't get anyone to, it's like making a YouTube video. You can make an hour-long amazing YouTube video, and if you don't have a good thumbnail or first 5 seconds, no one's going to watch it. You're never going to get any interaction. And
Yeah.
it's the same way with that, right? Or if you're selling to the wrong people, kind of, in a way, if you're portraying maybe art to people who don't have that feel for it, or that same taste, I guess, in a way, or they're just, like you said, it's a learned skill. If they don't have that skill, they can't really understand it the way it's supposed to be understood, then you're selling to the wrong people. And no matter how good your product is,
Yeah.
it's never going to get across. So just something interesting I thought about when you were talking about app design. And obviously that was actually a question I was going to ask down the road. You kind of answered it without me even bringing that topic up, was just because you designed the app kind of interface concept of that Just Pause product that you guys were pitching, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I did definitely a lot of the UX aspects of it. So um, I wasn't the only one who was saying what goes into the app, but the creation of what it looked like largely came from me.
Got you. One thing now I want to shift on as we kind of near the end here, Mark, is we talked about this earlier, Meditations, the book by Marcus Aurelius. What are some of the biggest lessons you maybe got out of that as you read it? I have not read it yet, for the record, but it's definitely on my list.
Yeah. So I read it several years ago, so it was at a very different time in my life. But I think one of the biggest things that came from it for me wasn't necessarily what Marcus Aurelius wrote or what he said, but it was just the fact that something written so long ago still held so much weight and so much value to people today, to myself today. Somebody living in a completely different world, completely different culture, uh, completely different life. And I'm able to draw connections, points of connection with his experience, with what he wrote about, what he talked about, because it was in a very real way. And I think that that's where a lot of my thought patterns when it came to the tangible and intangible aspects came in, because um, some of the things that he talked about was, don't just think about being a good man, like be one. It's one of those things where, you can think about theoretical things all day, and if you don't do anything about it, then what was the point? Or you can be only doing things, but if you're not thinking about why you're doing them, then what's the real value to you? Because other people might be benefiting, but like, are you benefiting? Like, are you growing? And are not necessarily are you growing in, like, wealth or success or anything like that, but on a personal character standpoint, are you growing? Are you furthering yourself? And I think that that was something that tied very deeply to my life and what I had experienced and where I had been, and I didn't know it yet, but a lot of where I was going in life.
Yeah, I really want to read that. It's something that, I mean, just so many people, like you said, it's amazing how it can just speak to people thousands of years later in completely different cultures, and the writings are just as relevant as they have ever been. It's really incredible, and that's another form of art, right? Writing. Like, not
Definitely.
everyone has that ability to transcend generations and generations and centuries even. Mark, another thing, if you had to give advice to a younger entrepreneur, maybe one thing that you wish you'd have known that you would tell them right off the bat, strictly in the sense of entrepreneurship, what would that one lesson be?
I think for me, it would be to, whether it would be talking to myself when I was younger, or anyone else, it would be just, again, taking risks, because I heard it explained to me in a class that, honestly, like, picking the safe road is one of the riskiest things you can do, because if you have your whole life planned out, nothing's going to go that way. Like, I've lived uh, most of my younger years, and I'm still someone quite young, but I was like most of high school, planning things out, saying that this is where I'm going to go, this is what I'm going to do in life, and none of that really came true, but it took different forms. So just taking calculated risks, but then also taking educated guesses, because when you're taking those calculated risks, you're gonna have to guess. You're not gonna know what you're doing. But if you're taking an educated guess, you at least have an idea. It might even be just, which way is the wind blowing. It could be the faintest thing, but whatever gives you that edge, that little bit of confidence or surety, just run with it. And if you feel like, okay, maybe this isn't the way, take a step back, think about it, look at where you are, look at how far you've come, and then if you need to, backtrack a little bit. Or if you need to, keep going, because things in life, they're always going to be changing. That's just how life is. And you have to be willing to go with the punches. You have to be willing to adjust.
Certainly. What you just said there reminded me of a quote by Mark Twain. I've lived through some terrible things, some of which actually happened. Right? You can't just let your mind trick you
Yep.
into worrying about everything that might be, and sometimes you just have to roll with it. So, Mark, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Do you have any major goals, both personally and professionally, that you think where you want to end up 5-10 years from now?
Yeah. I thought about this exact question, and I suppose I'll give the answer first and then my reasoning why. So my answer for that is, in 5 years and 10 years, I want to be in a place where I'm totally unable to recognize where I'm going to be. So in 5 years, I have no idea. Like, I'm going to be so far ahead, so more developed as a person, as a man, as a someone in the business field, that I could not even look at that and say, "Oh, that's where I'm at." Because 5 years ago, I couldn't say I knew that. And the reason why I say that is, in a lot of ways, life is essentially just an adventure, for lack of a better word. And I know that can get thrown around, but you're writing your own story, and in that way, like, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? I have no idea, but I know where I want to go. I have dreams, I have goals for sure. I want to own my own business. I want to start something successful. I want to lived overseas. I want to start a family, things like that. Like, those are all goals that I want, but who I am as a person, I don't want to be able to look back from 5 years and say, "Oh, I'm the exact same person I was 5 years ago."
Gotcha. I think that's an answer that I don't think I've ever really heard before, but I think that's actually one of, if not the best answer I've ever gotten to that question. I think that's, I want to, in 5 years, I want to be somewhere that is so, that I've built so much on where I'm at now, that I'm in a place that I couldn't even have imagined that I would be. And I think there's no better way to wrap this up, Mark, than on that note. I appreciate you coming on.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for being a guest. Hopefully you'll get to that point where you can't even recognize it, and then you can come on the podcast again and we can talk about it. So
look forward to it. Thanks for having me on.